MashaAllah. And I think this segues into the next question, which is about your work, which you have called Kunyaza. And it's not a word that you invented. It is a name of an actual technique, which I believe it originates in Rwanda. So I'd like to ask you then, Brother Habib, why did you choose to focus so much on this particular technique from Rwanda? Is it because you wanted to, just like your previous book, Illuminating the Darkness, Blacks and North Africans in Islam, you wanted to show that, Islam is not just about Arabs or South Asians or something, that people who were African, people who were Black, who looked maybe like yourself, had a lot to do with the spread of Islam, the spread of Orthodox Islam. And Islam has been on the continent, the African continent, from as far back as the time of the Prophet ﷺ himself. And then obviously, you've got the Maliki school spreading in North and West Africa and so on and so forth. Is that what motivated you to write about Kunyaza? And could you tell us a bit more about, obviously, I don't want you to give a summary of the book. There's a reason why you wrote it. And the book also has illustrations. So what exactly was that book about? You could also tell us a bit more about your other book, about illuminating the darkness and all that. How does Kunyaza as a book also differentiate itself from A Taste of Honey? So basically, I'm asking you for sort of like a primer for all your works, but mostly on Kunyaza, since that's your latest one to date. And yeah, whom would you recommend Kunyaza to? Because as I mentioned, it's got some illustrations, so it's definitely not on the family friendly side. Who's in the market to buy that sort of book?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so I need to probably again kind of go walk you through a quick journey in terms of how and why I wrote Kunyaza. So first I'll quickly just summarize what Kunyaza is about. So Kunyaza, like you mentioned, it refers to an African technique that originated from Rwanda, in East Central Africa, and it's basically a clitoral stimulation technique where a man uses his member, shall we say, to tap, stroke, and stimulate the female genitalia to elicit female ejaculation, orgasm, and sexual pleasure. That's in a nutshell what the tradition is about. A very high level summary. It was, according to legend, an ancient queen from Rwanda. She was married. Her husband was away on a military expedition, and uh, she was seeking some intimacy, shall we say? And then, but she called one of her guards to make love to her. The guard was petrified, and then obviously refrained initially. Then the queen summoned, said, if you don't make love to me, you're going to be in trouble. And then what the story says is that the guard was holding his member, and he started to, again, because he was worried and scared, he was tapping his member against her genitalia, against her rugongo, against her clitoris. And from there, it was said that this large gush of fluid emanated from her loins. And from there, it was said that Lake Kivu was born. Now, again, and the tradition, I mean, the technique was known as kunyaza, and the ejaculation or the female fluid was known as pinata. So it's I mean, the legend is probably obviously not true, but it's just like a interesting story in terms of how that tradition is taught and how a number of women teach the importance of clitoral stimulation. Because like I mentioned before, most women require clitoral stimulation in order to climax. So for me, how I came across this Kunyaza tradition and why I wanted to write a book about it was that after I wrote A Taste of Honey, so A Taste of Honey came out in 2015. And like I mentioned, I wanted to kind of speak about the contributions that Muslim scholars have made towards sexuality and sexual studies, as well as highlight some of the contributions that Africans had made. Because oftentimes we hear about the contributions of Arabs, we hear about the contribution of the Persians, we hear about the contribution of the Indians with the Kama Sutra and Anaranga, but we don't hear about the contributions about Africa. So that's what my intention was with A Taste of Honey in 2015. The book is quite dense, A Taste of Honey, that is, over like maybe 300 pages. And then I wanted to write another book, but maybe for general audiences, so speak about erotology and sexuality, but from an African Arab perspective, so not necessarily from a religious perspective. So A Taste of Honey is like speaking about the study of intimacy from a religious perspective. But I wanted to kind of speak also about the subject from a cultural perspective, like an Arab and African perspective. So like when you was asking about masculinity, I wanted to see like how did um traditional Arabs and Africans view masculinity. So it wasn't just about how many sexual partners you have in this whole hookup culture. It was about how you can be a man that is a provider both emotionally and sexually to your wife. So, and then I think oftentimes even a number of Muslims, the way they take this idea of polygamy or polygyny. A man being polygynous is the same as him being promiscuous, and that's not the same thing. A man have multiple wives is not the same as a man having multiple casual sex partners, but people kind of conflate the two. So because there's principles behind their understanding of what it means to be a man, because you need to be a man that can provide for whether you've got one, two, three, or four partners, or wives, shall I say. So I wrote this book called Illuminating the Performance, which is about African and Arab eritology. Again, not from a religious perspective, more from a cultural perspective, because I've got a number of people that follow me who aren't Muslim. And I wanted to highlight again the contributions that African cultures have made towards human sexuality or the study of human sexuality and sexual pleasure. Then someone, a reader of that book, Illuminating the Performance, emailed me and basically asked me why didn't I mention Kunyaza? And at that time, I hadn't heard of Kunyaza, and I did what most people do when they hear something new or interesting. I Googled it, so then I came across, this wonderful technique and the culture behind it. And at the time, there was a documentary that was being crowdfunded by Olivier Jourdain, who's from Belgium, is a Belgian filmmaker, and he was making a documentary called Kunyaza, and called Sacred Water. And I reached out to him because I wanted to hear again more about this technique because for me it was an African technique, an African culture. It was one that women were in the forefront teaching it. And it was one that, again, it was about men in teaching men the importance of women's sexual satisfaction, about women's pleasure. Um, and like I said, I reached out to a number of people from Rwanda, Uganda, and Kenya because it's also practiced there in neighboring countries where it's known as Kachabali. In Zimbabwe, it's known as Katera, I believe. So I saw that it was practiced in different parts of Africa, especially in East and Central Africa and parts of Southern Africa. And I thought, okay, I saw a couple of articles written in English. I saw a book in French and German, but I didn't see anything in English. And I thought, okay, actually, this will be good to document, to speak about the cultural history, the sexual history about this tradition, to amplify the voices of African sex educators, especially Black women in particular. Because oftentimes, and this is one of my frustrations, is that the only time I hear or see about the positive contribution, shall we say, of Black people is um, when we're speaking about race or slavery. Other than that, we don't really hear much, or entertainment. And then when we speak about sexuality or African sexuality, I often hear about female genital cutting, female genital mutilation. And it's always this idea that, Africans or Black people haven't contributed anything positively towards human sexuality. And even there are some um, understandings of that even among some of the Arab Muslims from as far back as like the 14th and 15th century. And that's why I wrote A Taste of Honey, Illuminating Darkness, to address some of the anti-Black racism that was prevalent in many pre-modern Muslim communities that scholars like Al-Jahid, Al-Suyuti, and Ibn al-Jawzi who all spoke about. So quite a long story short, I wanted to write Kunyaza, it wasn't specifically for Muslims, it was mainly about bringing to light this African technique that was, for me, again, and also something also I noticed I've got to add is that I noticed a number of Europeans, white Europeans, were speaking about Kunyaza. All of a sudden, it was becoming whitewashed and colonized and had like a white face. And I even saw some articles where they were saying this Kunyaza, this practice for female masturbation, or another article that I'm not going to say the name, but even I did an interview with a well-renowned media publication. And then again, they don't have to put my name, it's fine. But then they had two white women and they were arguing that Kunyaza is a feminist practice about female masturbation. It's just like, what? And this was a technique, a practice that was, and even how it's taught to help men understand women to obviously to feel empowered and feel and to own their pleasure and for them to both experience sexual pleasure together. So there is some you could argue like there's kind of like a gender war or like there's an attack on masculinity or especially heterosexual masculinity. And I was like, okay, I think this is important to kind of not only talk about this book because I think it's one that both men and women can buy into. I think men can buy into it because not only is teaching men about the female anatomy and how to bring their female partner to climax and experience pleasure, but also teaching him sexual discipline because it's a non-penetrative technique. Because men, the way we view sex, it's all about penetration. Whereas this is a technique which is teaching you delay your gratification, ensure that your partner is aroused and satisfied before you even think about penetration. So that's why, again, for me, it's something that both men and women can buy into. And then obviously there's this whole fascination and obsession with female ejaculation or squirting. And it was just quite interesting that in parts of East Africa where Kunyaza is practiced, female ejaculation is normal. It's like normalized. Whereas in the West, it's stigmatized. So again, I also wanted to kind of illustrate the way even certain sexual experiences and acts are viewed. It depends on the cultural perspective. So that's also wanted to highlight and kind of destigmatize the idea that female fluid is somewhat, it's bad or it's wrong or it's harmful or it's disgusting when we don't have those same views about male fluid. And likewise, female genitalia, where in parts of Africa it's praised and they don't talk about the differences in the vulva as being something that is deplorable. Whereas in the Western world, unfortunately, a lot of women, even white Western women, under pressure to attain this so-called perfect female anatomy or like what they call designer vagina, and they undergo surgeries like labiaplasty and all of these kind of so I wanted to kind of just help people, like you could say, a culture exchange where people can see the way we view women, the way we view sexuality, the way we view pleasure. It varies from culture to culture. And I think oftentimes we often speak about, especially Western sexology, from a Eurocentric perspective. And a lot of people think that's a perspective that is for everyone. And even, yes, so that's the reason why I wanted to write Kunyaza to counteract that. But funny enough, since Kunyaza's came out, I mean, it was picked up by the BBC in 2020, and I made a documentary with them called The Orgasm Gap. More Muslims have been intrigued by Kunyaza and interested in Kunyaza than A Taste of Honey. And I was always perplexed by that because A Taste of Honey was primarily written for Muslims. Um, but, and this is quite, I don't know, maybe the way I marketed the book or maybe the way I entitled it, but I feel that more Muslims are more comfortable hearing about sex and intimacy when Islam is not linked to the like subject or the title or even Muslim. So they can hear about like the five love languages. That's a Christian sex book or Christian intimacy book, sorry. It's not a book. I'm not saying non-Christians can't read it, but Gary Chapman is a pastor. He spoke about it from a Christian perspective, from his experiences counseling marriage couples. And he speaks about the Bible and things like that when he was putting together these five languages. But that's been widely embraced by Muslims. But if I were to say Al Suyuti, or Al Ghazali, who wrote, a lot of books about theology, about tafsir, about sirah, they also write about sex and intimacy. A lot of Muslims are uncomfortable to talk about it unless they speak about marriage. So I mean, like marriage, like in terms of the hukum or like halal and haram, but in terms of sexual pleasure, and I use sexual pleasure intentionally as opposed to sex because many people are having sex, but not many people are having pleasurable sex. Many women in particular are having sex, many women obviously having children, but not many women have experienced an orgasm, and not many women are having pleasurable sex because there are a number of women who've experienced vaginismus or have or still are having painful sex. So that's why I speak more about pleasure as opposed to just the sex act as well, because it's more holistic. So again, I just think with Muslims, and this is something again like I've realized, if I direct my messaging to general people that it's not really Islamic, some Muslims are more comfortable to listen to it. If I say this is like an Islamic or speaking about Islamic history, like Muslim scholars, a lot of Muslims are those same people are uncomfortable to speak about that or to hear about it because they have somewhat detach sexuality from spirituality. When I'll argue from an Islamic perspective, the two are intertwined. That Islam is a sexually enlightened religion and sensuality should not be devoid from spirituality. But again, depending on the Muslim, their cultural background, how they view intimacy and things like that, they may be, they like to, even a number of Muslim men that I know of who feel uncomfortable to hear about like a Muslim woman, especially if she's wearing a hijab, speak about intimacy matters, even if she's speaking about it in a modest and informative and educational way, they feel really uncomfortable to hear a woman with a hijab speaking about intimacy, but they can listen to a non-Muslim woman who is even scantily clad speaking about sexual matters, even in a vulgar way, from that same very individual. So there is like a bit of a hypocrisy, and but then it's their view of intimacy that why is it, if it's like this so-called saintly figure that is that's asexual, she can't be speaking about because of what the hijab for them represents. Whereas if it's a woman that is not wearing a hijab, she's not Muslim, they're more than welcome to not only listen to her but learn from her. So that's something again that I've noticed. And again, you can't change everyone. So that's why the same way I know even for myself, there are some Muslims from certain communities who wouldn't feel comfortable listening to me because I haven't got a big beard. I mean, I've got a struggle beard. I haven't got a beard, mashallah, like yourself. So I tried to grow up, but I can't, it doesn't connect. I'm not of a certain hue. So if I was maybe olive complexion and maybe had aquiline nose and wavy hair, maybe people might, and wore a thobe, then people might more likely to listen to me more. Because I'm more respected. So I understand all of that. So again, that's why I can't force those people, but I can put the information out, and those people who maybe do have a certain image that they can connect and resonate with. Again, if we're saying the same message, then obviously they can listen to those people. So that's why, even like your question that you're asking about illustrations and things like that, there are some people, highly inappropriate, and they find that they couldn't read such a book with such illustrations. But then those same people would read a book by the Ottomans. So the Ottomans, they wrote a number of sex manuals, and they had illustrations, and that's part of our Islamic heritage, which they will celebrate. So again, that's why for me, it's I don't spend too much time focusing on the naysayers or people who are uncomfortable with my work or the approach. It's those who, inshallah, I think may benefit from it or will benefit from it. I focus on them, and it's not trying to, like I said again, trying to please everyone because it's impossible. It's an impossible task.
MashaAllah, very beautifully put. And I think I can also take some of that into stride because, yes, there is a certain sort of message I try to convey with my episodes on this podcast, but the haters are going to hate. So what can you do? In the end, you just have to keep going your own path. And I guess it gets a bit easier as you keep on walking the path. And in terms of the truth, there are many ways to the truth. It's not like Brother Habib or myself are the gatekeepers of the only and exclusive way to the truth. So if someone finds the message to be more palatable from another avenue altogether, Bismillah, well, the more the merrier. Alhamdulillah.